if you will be perfect, go and sell all that you have and give to the poor, and come and follow me. These words echoed through the church that day that the young Anthony, at 18 years of age, entered the church, and then echoed also through his deepest being. These words have had an effect on many souls across the Christian centuries. Another great and shining example would be St. Francis of Assisi, who took it very literally. But this case here is much earlier in time. It's the middle of the 3rd century, and therefore still during a persecution period when there were many Christians being martyred. Some would take refuge in desert places, but then, as time went on, the advantage of those desert places was perceived. Anthony initially started in the area where the family property was, and then went further and further away from men, and, as it were, got lost in God physically. It could have ended there, but in the providence of God, he was to be a magnet, and this is the beginning of a pattern that will repeat itself over the centuries. First of all, there is that stripping of all and a complete availability to the Holy Spirit, who then becomes the interior master. And then, and only then, is that charism of spiritual paternity, accompaniment of souls, given. And even though the priesthood is not necessarily involved in the monastic life, for women can have it as well, and will have it in a convent, it is something which is linked with the structure of the church, even though it's not of its actual hierarchical essence. It is the mystical side of the church. The hierarchy is linked precisely to the continuation of the power of Christ in his priesthood. But this other one, the charismatic, is linked to its life. If it is authentic, it is extremely powerful. The desert, bit by bit, was peopled, and from being desert was a hive of spiritual activity. We have a whole literature coming out of the desert movement, and this then becomes the basis of authentic monastic life in its essence. Why? Because when God is all, then God is heard. And what is heard can be transmitted. We have certain collections of sayings and of stories which have come down to us. An important one would be that of St. John Cassian, who went with Germanus, his friend, from the Holy Land, where they had made profession, to the well-known desert of Egypt, to collect spirituality, to take down what they heard. And we know that St. Benedict wanted it used, and so we have, through St. Benedict, this coming through to the West. St. Anthony of Egypt, feasted on this day, is regarded as the patriarch of monks, and St. Benedict is regarded as the patriarch of the monks of the West. But the bridge is there by the fact that St. Benedict, in his rule, laid down that the conferences of Cassian be read before Compline. And so we have this being heard over the Christian centuries, and he's still heard in the monastic formation in any serious monastery. It's staple diet. One can't get away from the roots. And therefore St. Benedict westernizes, latinizes, regularizes the spirit of the East, which is mystical, radical, and living. So much so that sometimes they are quite elastic in certain things, for instance taking young people very, very, very young, and all things which we might find surprising, but they are open to the Spirit, and they do not have this legal notion of having juridical structures which separates families of monks in the same way that we do, congregations. They have the great ancient universal fraternity of monks, the brotherhood, which goes back to the desert and which involves a monastic succession not dissimilar to the apostolic succession. One cannot just become a monk. One receives the charism. One receives the rite of succession. It's important to them. And so we look at the work of the Spirit. We must remember that there's no question of division among Christians at that stage. It's all one church. And indeed we have, not too far from Rome, an example of the ancient undivided charism. It's the old monastery of St. Nilus at Grotta Ferrata, which was founded before the division between East and West, and has carried on to this day, but therefore in undivided mode, under Rome, but with Eastern rite. They also have a Western chapel, a very interesting phenomenon. And there one sees time standing still. The Eastern liturgy is something which blends very well with contemplative monastic life, because it's unhurried, upward in its thrust, and far away from the noise of men. God is not in a hurry, and in calm mode he is encountered. Something of that calm mode comes also in true monastic liturgy in the Western rite. The Gregorian chant rocks the soul to sleep in the arms of the Blessed Trinity, as it were, rather as the beloved disciple was able to rest upon the bosom of the Lord in the upper room. It's something which is not hackneyed, it is always new and gentle. When well executed, it leads the soul to God and has a resonance of its own. And it should be, by the way, if possible, not accompanied, because the natural voice is the best instrument. And so we have what comes from the desert, a teaching, a body of knowledge of God and of man. And there are no shortcuts. We cannot think that we are better supersonic monks that can get things done quickly and better than our ancestors. It takes time to dig deeply. It takes energy to be radical. It takes energy also to protect against contamination. And contamination is more widespread now, especially in the West, than it would have been in the calm, unsullied desert of Egypt and Syria and Cappadocia, and also in the desert of our western islands and mountains. The equivalent is also here. Monks love distant places, isolated places, for there God alone is heard well. And so we need to be aware that we can ruin the whole enterprise by bringing into the hearth of our enclosure the Trojan horse, not just television, but also anything which is linked with the world. It can only be one bleep away, and one bleep can bring in ruin. The Carthusian life has remained pure, and I remember being deeply moved by the fact that it was the same life as lived through the centuries, never reformed, for never deformed, and what worked still worked. But I do recall how in the years of solitude, the early encounter with La Trappe had always left its trace, and the awareness of what was complete hiddenness in perpetual and unbroken silence never left me. Because there is a problem when one has to speak once or twice a week. There is a leakage there, and the haunting thirst of being hidden and known only unto God was always there. The Trappist life is complete and beautiful, and it must not be easily dismissed. It still works, for the reasons that it's always worked, when it is lived for the full and to the full, for God alone. The French tend to be idealistic, and that has its advantages. They follow things through to the logical conclusion. And so does the Holy Spirit. Where is he sending vocations? He's sending them there where he will have freedom to act. It's a huge risk, the contemplative life. It's not worth entering and then not going all the way. It's better to become a good father of a family. Anyone can talk while working in the world. Anyone can work with that frenetic attitude which can get into the monastery and devastate it in the world. One needs an other attitude in the monastery, where work is at the surface of contemplation and done in contemplative mode, which in practice means silence. It's quite different, and that's the spirituality of monastic world in the desert. Simple, but freeing for the mind. It's a continuum. There's no moment in which one is not in contemplation. If there is a compartmentalization of life in the monastic world itself, prayer, non-prayer, prayer, non-prayer, then it has not been fully engaged in. It never stops. Pray without ceasing is the invitation of the Apostle. That can only be done when the soul is free to be alone with God. And that means unknown to any but him. The mystery of the Trappist, unknown even to his brother, is something sublime and mystical. Brother knows not the heart of brother, but loves him in his aura of otherness. And in that level, charity is far more intense, for not banal or simply human. Je me souviens, comme l'attrait de la trappe était énorme, même aux Chartreuses, il y avait toujours ce désir qui hantait. Être caché, inconnu, connu de Dieu seul. Et je me souviens avoir écrit ceci en voyant encore l'image de la trappe dans ma tête. Je pense encore à ce cher monastère qui berça ma jeunesse en son doux chant, la trappe. Ah, qu'est-il? Quel est ce mystère qui tire, attire, et puis déchire tant le cœur de tout jeune homme qui entend. Tant grand silence dont l'aiguë sirène perce à jamais le plaisir que défend ce vaste mur qui rompt la cantilène de tout ce qui peut tirer sur les cordes des cœurs inconnus passés par ici, qui portent seuls le monde qui déborde. C'est être jamais fait pour être ainsi. Pourtant, ce mot religieux, trappiste, me parle. Aurais-je fait mauvaise piste?